In the early years of the war, Germany still believed in miracles. The Blitzkrieg had swept across Europe like a storm. France had fallen, the Low Countries had collapsed, and Britain stood alone across the gray waters of the Channel. Yet even as Luftwaffe bombers darkened the London sky, Adolf Hitler was already thinking beyond the war of tanks and planes. He wanted a weapon that could erase distance itself, a machine that could strike across oceans, a blow so sudden and godlike that the world would never recover. He called it die Vergeltungswaffe, the weapon of retribution. To the scientists at Peenemünde, a remote testing ground on the Baltic coast, that word meant something else entirely: destiny. In a cluster of wind-battered barracks and concrete hangars, a team of young engineers worked day and night on a dream that bordered on the impossible: a rocket that could fly 200 miles and fall on its target faster than the speed of sound. They called it the A4. At the center of that dream stood a tall, boyish engineer with clear blue eyes and an almost missionary calm: Werner von Braun. He was only in his late 20s, brilliant and charming, with a mind that could turn equations into visions. To him, the A4 was not a weapon, but a step toward the stars. Our work, he told his team, is about reaching beyond Earth, even if we must first aim at London. Underneath his idealism, the reality was harsher. Peenemünde was funded not by dreamers, but by the Reich's hunger for vengeance. The army wanted results. The SS wanted power. Hitler wanted a miracle. The first prototypes were crude. The engineers built them out of scavenged steel and aluminum, their fins riveted by hand. They were fueled by alcohol and liquid oxygen, temperamental, explosive, unpredictable. Test after test ended in disaster. The rockets exploded on the pad, flipped sideways, or tore themselves apart in midair. Von Braun would watch silently as the wreckage burned, taking notes even as the flames reached for the night sky. He said, "We are learning. Each failure brings us closer." To the soldiers overseeing the tests, it looked like madness. To von Braun, it was evolution. When one rocket managed to rise a few hundred feet before collapsing in a fireball, he called it a success. He said, "It left the ground. The rest is mathematics." By 1941, the A4 project had consumed millions of Reichsmarks, more than any tank battalion or bomber squadron. The German Army High Command grew restless. They wanted practical weapons, not fantasies. But then came the turning point: the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. As the Eastern Front consumed millions of men, Hitler's faith in conventional warfare began to crack. The miracle he had demanded suddenly became a necessity. He told Albert Speer, "We need a weapon that will make the English tremble again." Peenemunde's founding doubled overnight. The tests grew larger, louder, and more dangerous. Villagers miles away reported strange thunder at night and streaks of fire that rose into the clouds. The A4 rockets reached higher and faster with each trial. One climbed to 60 kilometers before falling back into the sea, the first object made by man ever to reach the edge of space. Von Braun wrote in his diary that night, "For a few seconds, our machine touched eternity." To Hitler, that line was irresistible. The propaganda ministry seized on it immediately. "A new age of warfare has begun," declared Goebbels. From the heavens shall come our vengeance. But vengeance demanded more than math. By 1942, Peenemünde was no longer a research station. It was a fortress of secrecy. Thousands of workers labored in underground halls, guarded by SS officers. The scientists became soldiers, their white coats replaced by black uniforms. Orders came from the Reich Chancellery itself. Accelerate production, no matter the cost. Von Braun's team was now caught in a moral no man's land. They were dreamers serving a tyrant, physicists building the future for a regime trapped in the past. Some believed they could use Hitler's war to fund their vision of spaceflight. Others simply feared for their lives. Each successful test brought applause in Berlin and dread in Peenemünde. The scientists knew what their creation would do once it was perfected. The A4 would not carry men to the stars. It would carry a ton of explosives to London. One evening in December 1942, von Braun stood on the frozen launch field, staring at the skeletal frame of the latest prototype. Snow fell silently around him. The rocket towered above the floodlights, sleek and cold, steam hissing from its fuel lines like the breath of a sleeping dragon. Behind him, SS officers murmured about quotas and deadlines. Somewhere in the distance, the Baltic waves crashed against the shore. Von Braun spoke softly to his chief engineer, Walter Dornberger. "If we succeed," he said, "we will prove that spaceflight is possible." Dornberger looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he replied, "and we will also prove that man can destroy from farther away than ever before." The two men stood in silence as the rocket's engines roared to life. Flames engulfed the launch pad. The ground trembled. For a moment, the machine seemed to hesitate. Then it rose, slow and steady, climbing through the snow into the blackness above. A cheer went up. Telemetry officers shouted readings. Von Braun watched until it vanished into the clouds, a fading spark against the night. When it struck the sea miles away, the impact registered on seismographs. For the first time in history, a weapon had touched the edge of space. In Berlin, Hitler smiled when he heard the report. At Peenemünde, von Braun did not. He knew what was coming next. The dream was no longer his. It belonged to the Reich.
The year 1943 began with smoke and silence. Germany was still at war with the world, but something in the air had changed. The thunder of victory was gone. In its place came a grinding exhaustion. Factories running on fumes, trains overloaded with wounded soldiers, cities dimmed to conserve power. In the east, Stalingrad had fallen. For the first time, the Reich bled openly. And when Hitler bleeds, he demands miracles. In February, the Führer summoned his inner circle to the Wolfslair. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, brought with him a series of photographs from Peenemünde, the A4 prototype standing against the Baltic sky, its silver hull glowing like a cathedral spire. Hitler stared at it for a long time, his pale hands trembling slightly. "This will change everything. This is the vengeance of Germany." From that moment, the A4 had a new name, Vergeltungswaffe 2, the V2. Weapon of Retribution Number 2. In the laboratories at Peenemünde, the change was immediate. The place that had once felt like a university, all laughter, chalkboards, and mathematics, became a military base. SS guards replaced technicians. Barbed wire arose where sand dunes had been. Von Braun's team no longer designed for science. they designed for the Reich. The V-2 was now a weapon, and weapons required mass production. To meet Hitler's demands, they needed hundreds, thousands of rockets. The factories of Germany were already stretched beyond breaking. So, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, proposed a solution: slave labor. In a forest near the town of Nordhausen, engineers and prisoners carved tunnels deep into the Harz Mountains. The project was called Mittelwerk, and it was hell on earth. Inside the mountain there was no day, no night. The air was thick with dust and sweat, the stench of oil and death. Tens of thousands of prisoners, political captives, Jews, resistance fighters from France and Poland, were forced to work 12-hour shifts assembling V-2 rockets by hand. The engines that had once symbolized progress were now built by men who would never see the sky. Prisoners died by the hundreds each week, crushed by machinery, shot by guards, starved until they could no longer stand. When one collapsed on the assembly line, another was dragged from the barracks to replace him. The tunnels echoed with coughing, shouting, and the clang of steel. A survivor later wrote, "We were building death, and death was building us." Von Braun visited Mittelwerk only a handful of times. Each visit left him quieter than before. He walked the tunnels in his leather boots, surrounded by SS officers, while skeletal men lifted engines the size of cars. The prisoners stared at him, the tall young scientist who had dreamed of reaching the stars. He never met their eyes. After one inspection, he turned to his assistant and said softly, "At Peenemünde, we looked upward. Here, everything points downward." But he stayed silent, because silence, in 1943, meant survival. Back at Peenemünde, the tests continued. The V-2 was no longer a crude experiment. It was a towering 14-meter missile of polished steel, its warhead carrying nearly a ton of explosives. It could travel at 5,000 kilometers per hour, arc 80 kilometers above Earth, and strike its target without warning. It was the first true ballistic missile in human history. A weapon faster than sound, invisible to radar, unstoppable once launched. On October 3, 1942, they had seen the prototype touch the edge of space. In the summer of 1943, they achieved perfection. A V-2 rose from the Peenemünde pad and disappeared into the clouds. Minutes later, 190 miles away, it hit its target precisely. The control room erupted in cheers. Von Braun allowed himself a brief smile. Then came the explosion, not in the distance, but at home. That night, as the scientists celebrated, the roar of engines filled the sky. Peenemünde was under attack. British bombers, hundreds of them, crossed the coast and dropped tons of explosives on the research base. Runways vanished in fire. Workshops collapsed. The dormitories burned. When morning came, more than 700 people were dead, including scores of forced laborers and technicians. The RAF had struck after decoding intercepted messages from the German High Command. The Allies now knew what the wonder weapon was. The destruction forced the SS to relocate all production underground, into the tunnels at Mittelwerk. The dream of science had gone fully into the shadows. Down in those tunnels, the work continued without pause. Engineers walked past corpses on the way to the assembly line. Guards hanged prisoners at the entrances as examples. Yet the rockets kept coming. Each one cost 100,000 marks, required 30 tons of steel, and took more human lives to build than it would ever claim in battle. One SS officer joked, "We have found perpetual motion, the motion of men dying for machines." Von Braun's notes from late 1943 are sparse and cryptic.
He wrote of technical difficulties, of guidance systems unstable, of combustion anomalies. But between the lines, there was something else: fatigue, doubt, fear. He knew what he had created. He could no longer pretend otherwise. In one private conversation, recorded years later, he confessed, "I wanted to reach the stars. Instead, I reached London." By the end of 1943, the first operational V-2s were rolling off the lines at Middelburg. They stood in rows like silent giants, painted black and white, their noses pointed towards the heavens. Each one bore the same stenciled label: Vergeltungswaffe 2, weapon of retribution, weapon of desperation. The dream that had begun with curiosity now lived on cruelty. The wonder weapon was ready and waiting for orders. In Berlin, Hitler was already rehearsing his speech to announce its arrival. He would call it the hand of vengeance from the heavens. He didn't know that in the end, it would strike hardest at his own empire.
The first one came without warning. At 6:43 in the evening, September 8, 1944, a flash lit up the London sky, followed by a deep rolling boom that rattled windows across the city. There had been no siren, no drone of engines, no time to run for cover. People thought it was a gas explosion, or maybe an earthquake. But when rescuers reached the site on Staveley Road, they found a crater 30 feet wide and bodies strewn across the rubble. The Germans called it Vergeltungswaffe 2. The world called it the V-2 rocket. It was the first weapon in human history to travel faster than sound, so fast that its victims never heard it coming. From underground bunkers in Holland, German crews in black uniforms wheeled the slender 14-meter missiles onto mobile launchers. Their engines burned alcohol and liquid oxygen, hissing like beasts in their last breath before takeoff. Each missile carried a 1-ton warhead, but its true power was psychological. When the countdown reached 0, the earth shook. The V-2 rose on a pillar of flame, vanished into the clouds, and crossed the North Sea in less than 5 minutes. Londoners learned that if you heard the explosion, you were already safe. For Hitler, the moment was divine. He ordered champagne at the Wolfslair and told his staff, "England shall bleed as Germany has bled." Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels announced that the wonder weapon had arrived, that divine vengeance descends from the heavens. Posters across Berlin showed the V-2 arcing gracefully into the sky, leaving behind a white trail that looked like a comet. But there was a truth no poster could hide. Each launch cost more than a fighter plane, more than a tank, more than Germany could afford. And the rockets were nowhere near as accurate as promised. In London, the rockets fell at random. Sometimes they hit schools, sometimes churches, sometimes nothing but open fields. The guidance systems drifted miles off target, their gyroscopes shaken by launch vibrations. The scientists at Peenemünde had calculated with precision, but war does not follow equations. Between September 1944 and March 1945, more than 1,400 V-2s struck London, killing nearly 3,000 people and injuring tens of thousands more. Thousands more fell on Antwerp, Brussels, and Paris. The missiles killed civilians, not soldiers. They destroyed homes, not armies. They frightened millions, but they changed nothing. Meanwhile, the cost of this miracle weapon was crushing the Reich. Each V-2 required 20,000 man-hours, 10 tons of copper, and 30 tons of steel. Each consumed resources that could have built desperately needed aircraft and artillery. And for every one launched, another was lost to malfunction, exploding on the pad or veering off course into the sea. Even Goebbels, ever the fanatic, began to worry. "The Führer's faith is absolute," he wrote in his diary, "but faith is not fuel." In the tunnels of Mittelwerk, thousands of slaves continued to die for that faith. The roar of rocket engines echoed through the mountain as the SS forced prisoners to test engines under live fire. The scientists called it vibration analysis. The prisoners called it hell. British intelligence called it target crossbow. In late 1944, Allied reconnaissance planes spotted the mobile launch sites hidden in forests and fields across occupied Europe. Bomber Command began hunting them relentlessly, the so-called ski sites, narrow concrete ramps disguised as barns. But the Germans kept moving, launching at night, firing from trucks that could vanish before dawn. Londoners never saw the rockets. They only saw the aftermath, a street reduced to dust, a bus twisted like a toy, the eerie silence before the rescue sirens began to wail. One eyewitness, a nurse, described it years later. "It wasn't like the Blitz. There was no warning, no noise, no enemy in the sky, just a flash, and then people screaming. You'd look up, and there'd be nothing there, only clouds." In Peenemünde, von Braun watched from afar, horrified. The weapon he had dreamed of as a vehicle to reach the stars was now murdering civilians by the thousands, but he could not stop it. He had become a prisoner of his own creation and of the regime that owned it. In November 1944, he was arrested briefly by the Gestapo for defeatist talk after suggesting that Germany would lose the war. He was released only because Hitler himself intervened. "The Führer still needs you," an SS officer told him coldly. Von Braun returned to his work, but something inside him had broken. "We are using science to dig our own grave," he told his assistant, quietly, while the next missile waited on its launch pad. As the war dragged into its final winter, even Hitler's inner circle began to lose faith in the Wunderwaffe. The rockets had not broken British morale. They had not stopped the Allied armies advancing from the west or the Soviets closing in from the east. Instead, they had become symbols of the Reich's madness, brilliant, costly, and utterly futile. In March 1945, the last V-2s were launched from the Dutch town of The Hague. One of them struck a cinema in Antwerp, killing 567 people, mostly civilians. It was the deadliest single V-2 attack of the war. The following week, Allied troops overran the launch sites. The mobile ramps stood abandoned, their crews fled, their rockets rusting in the cold rain. The weapons of vengeance had fallen silent. In Berlin, Hitler raged in his bunker, demanding more launches. His generals lied to him. "They are still firing," they said. But by then, there were no rockets left to fire, no engineers left to build them, no cities left to defend. The dream of the Wunderweapon had become a nightmare of arithmetic. Thousands dead, billions spent, and not one battle won. When the war ended weeks later, the only trace of the V-2's legacy lay in shattered craters across Europe and in the haunted eyes of those who had built it. The rain of fire had ended, and with it, Germany's belief in miracles. But the weapon itself, sleek, deadly, magnificent in its terrible beauty, would not die. The victors would not allow it to, because the future it promised still glimmered beneath the ash. The winter of 1945 was the coldest Germany had ever known, not because of the snow, but because hope itself had frozen. The Reich that once stretched across a continent had shrunk to a graveyard of cities. Berlin was burning. Trains no longer ran. Factories lay in ruins. And yet, deep beneath a mountain in the Harz, the machines still roared. Inside the tunnels of Mittelwerk, the last V-2 rockets were being assembled by the light of dim bulbs and the flicker of dying torches. The air smelled of fuel, sweat, and death. The Allied bombers could no longer reach them here, but the war had already reached its end. The SS guards shouted, the prisoners worked, and the scientists watched the collapse of their world with the same numb disbelief as the rest of Germany. The Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon, had become a factory of ghosts. For Werner von Braun, the last months of the war were a blur of exhaustion and fear. He knew Germany was finished. The rockets that had once promised victory were now being hoarded, dismantled, or buried to hide them from the approaching Allies. Every day, Peenemünde was bombed again. Every week, another engineer disappeared, drafted into the army, arrested by the Gestapo, or simply killed in the chaos. The SS had taken full control of Mittelwerk. They no longer trusted the scientists. They treated them as servants, clever animals kept alive only because they knew how to make the rockets work. Von Braun, walking through the tunnels in February, saw prisoners collapsing at the assembly line. Their faces were gray, their bodies skeletal. One guard struck a man across the head with a wrench for moving too slowly. The scientist stopped, frozen. Hissed an officer beside him. He did, but that night he wrote in his notes, "We are launching souls to heaven long before rockets." At the same time, the Allies were closing in from all sides. The Soviets were approaching Berlin from the east, and the Americans were pushing through the Rhine. The men of Peenemünde faced a choice: surrender to the Russians, who would almost certainly drag them to Siberia, or to the Americans, who might at least understand their science. The choice was moral in theory. In practice, it was survival. By March 1945, the SS had begun destroying documents, burning archives, and executing prisoners to erase evidence of Mittelwerk. The scientists knew they had days left before they too vanished into the smoke. In secret, von Braun and a handful of trusted engineers, including Dornberger, Debus, and Stuhlinger, began packing the blueprints, guidance gyroscopes, and technical data of the V-2. They hid them in barrels, suitcases, and even the backs of trucks disguised as farm vehicles. When an SS officer asked where they were going, von Braun smiled thinly and said, "To relocate the program deeper into Germany, as ordered." The officer didn't question him. They were driving towards surrender. Meanwhile, at Peenemünde, the last V-2 launch was carried out in silence. There were no speeches, no photographs. The men who once cheered at the sight of the rocket's flame now watched it rise without emotion, knowing it was the end. As the missile vanished into the gray clouds, von Braun's assistant, Klaus Riedel, murmured, "There goes the last of Germany." When it hit the North Sea minutes later, no one cared. By April, the tunnels of Mittelwerk were a grave. The guards had fled. The prisoners wandered out in rags, dazed, staring at the sunlight many had not seen in years. The engineers who returned later found the place littered with bodies, thousands of them. A survivor recalled, "The first thing we saw were the rockets. They stood upright, perfect, clean, and the men who built them lay dead at their feet." The Allies were horrified when they entered the site. The 104th Infantry Division, the first Allied unit to reach the Harz region, described Mittelwerk as a necropolis built by engineers. They counted more than 20,000 dead who had perished building the wonder weapon. The miracle, it turned out, had a price: one human life for every rocket launched. Von Braun and his team drove south through the chaos of collapsing Germany. The roads were jammed with refugees, Wehrmacht stragglers, and bombed-out vehicles. Every town they passed was smoking. They traveled at night to avoid Soviet patrols, sleeping in barns and abandoned hotels. When they reached the Bavarian Alps, von Braun gathered his men. He told them, "We are not soldiers, we are scientists. If we surrender, we must do so to people who understand science." He meant the Americans. They buried their most valuable documents in steel drums near Oberammergau and then waited. For days they listened to artillery in the distance, wondering which army would reach them first. Finally, on May 2, 1945, a convoy of American jeeps appeared on the mountain road. The men of Peenemünde, still in their Wehrmacht uniforms but carrying no weapons, raised their hands. An American officer stepped out and asked, "Who are you?" Von Braun replied simply, "We are the rocket engineers." Within hours, they were under U.S. custody. In Berlin, Hitler was dead. The Reich had burned itself out. But in the notebooks and memories of those engineers, the dream still smoldered, a dream twisted and blackened, but not destroyed. As the Americans packed up the captured V-2s and loaded them onto ships bound for New Mexico and Texas, one U.S. colonel looked at the sleek, silver rockets and muttered, "They lost the war, but they just might win the future." The men of Peenemünde had survived the Third Reich, but their redemption would come at a terrible cost of forgetting. They had built death and called it progress. Now they would call it exploration. When the war ended, the rockets did not. Germany lay in ashes, cities crushed into dust, millions dead, the Reich reduced to rubble and silence. But amid that ruin, the Allies found something extraordinary. Hundreds of V-2 missiles, thousands of blueprints, and the minds that had built them. For the first time in history, humankind possessed the technology to touch the edge of space, and it had been born in hell. In the summer of 1945, American trucks rumbled through the shattered roads of Europe, carrying a strange cargo: disassembled V-2 rockets, boxes of gyroscopes and valves, crates of fragile scientific notebooks. Soldiers joked that they were moving Hitler's toys. The official name of the mission was Operation Paperclip. Its goal was simple: capture the German scientists before the Soviets did. At the top of the list was Wernher von Braun. He and his team were transferred to the custody of the U.S. Army and quietly shipped across the Atlantic, far from the ruins of Peenemünde. They arrived not as prisoners, but as prizes, the spoils of a scientific war. The Soviets, furious, scoured the ruins of Mittelwerk and Peenemünde to find whoever was left. Those unlucky enough to fall into Soviet hands were sent east to work under armed guard in secret research facilities. The new war had already begun, not of ideology, but of propulsion. Von Braun and his engineers were taken first to Fort Bliss, Texas, and then to a testing range in White Sands, New Mexico, a desert that reminded them eerily of the dunes near Peenemünde. There, under the blazing sun, American soldiers and former Nazi engineers stood side by side, assembling rockets that bore both a swastika's shadow and a star's promise. To the Americans, the V-2 was not a weapon of vengeance anymore. It was a laboratory, a doorway to the future. The irony was unbearable. The same missile that had fallen on London now rose harmlessly over the desert, leaving a tail of white smoke against the sky. Reporters called it the dawn of the rocket age. Few mentioned that it had been built by slave labor in the darkness of metalwork. At night, von Braun would sit outside his quarters, staring up at the sky. He spoke rarely of the war. When he did, he used careful words. Our purpose, he told an interviewer in 1946, was to explore the frontiers of space. The war merely accelerated the timetable. He did not speak of the men who had died in the tunnels. History, as always, preferred triumph to guilt. By the 1950s, von Braun had become a celebrity, clean-shaven, smiling, speaking fluent English. The same hands that had once signed reports for the SS now held chalk before American audiences, sketching the future of space travel. He designed rockets for the U.S. Army, then for NASA. His Saturn engines would one day lift men toward the moon. He had traded one flag for another, one vision of destiny for its mirror. In the Soviet Union, his counterparts, men like Helmut Grotterup and the captured teams from Mittelwerk, were forced to work under tight surveillance, helping to create the R-1 and later the R-7 rockets that would eventually launch Sputnik. They too were haunted by the same contradiction, the dream of flight carried on the wings of horror. Between them, the two halves of Peenemünde, one in Huntsville, one in Moscow, built the Cold War sky. The world had divided, but the rocket's lineage remained pure, born from vengeance, reborn as ambition. In London, the memory of the V-2 never faded. Decades later, survivors of the attacks still spoke of the night the sky cracked open without warning. One elderly woman, interviewed in 1969, the year of the first moon landing, said quietly, "I watched the Americans go to the moon on television. The rocket looked beautiful, and I thought, I've heard that sound before." The contrast was impossible to ignore. July 16, 1969, Cape Kennedy, Florida. The Saturn V stood on the launch pad, immense, gleaming white, its engines dwarfing the men who would ride it. At 9:32 a.m., the countdown reached 0. The ground shook. Flames erupted. A thunder greater than war filled the air. Inside the control room, engineers cheered as Apollo 11 climbed toward the heavens. In the crowd, von Braun smiled, clapping politely. No one mentioned that the rocket's heart, its plumbing, its turbines, its guidance, was the same as the V-2's. No one said that the first object to reach space had not carried men, but explosives. When asked years later whether he ever felt guilt for his role in Hitler's weapon, von Braun replied carefully, "My work has always been about reaching higher. The rockets worked perfectly. It was the war that failed." History accepted that answer because it wanted to. In 1977, von Braun died of cancer. At his funeral, a choir sang softly as colleagues from NASA laid wreaths beside his casket. One former engineer from Peenemünde stood apart from the crowd, hands clasped behind his back. "He was a dreamer," he whispered. "We all were. But dreams are never innocent." Today, in museums across Europe, pieces of the V-2 still rest behind glass, the polished steel nose cone, the rocket motor, the shattered guidance ring. Tourists pass by quickly, on their way to see jet fighters and tanks. Few stop long enough to read the small plaque beneath the display. The V-2 rocket, the world's first ballistic missile, built at Peenemünde and Mittelwerk, 1939 to 1945. Over 20,000 laborers died in its construction. In that single sentence lies the balance of the 20th century. The price of progress weighed against the cost of humanity. The wonder weapon never won a battle. It never turned the tide of war, but it built the bridge that carried mankind into the stars. And in doing so, it left behind a shadow that still falls across every rocket that rises today. Epilogue. A British historian once said, "The V2 was the last weapon of one age and the first machine of another. That is its tragedy and its immortality. The first rocket to reach space did not carry dreams, it carried death. But from that same fire, humanity learned to look upward and never stop."